Welcome back to part 2 in the Incra joint series. Today is the turn of the through dovetail and we're going to be making a bits and bobs box for my MFT table. If that sounds interesting, stick around. I don't know about you, but I'm a devil for collecting things as I'm working through a job, and before I know it my tables become littered with pencils and rulers and clamps and fence dogs. All sorts of things tend to collect on my working surface and I'm forever moving things around. To solve that problem I'm going to create a small tray that rests into the profile of the MFT table, and that will allow me to put my things in there, my bits and bobs box. But more importantly, we're going to be using through dovetails, and the episode's not about building the box, it's about using the Incra system on the Festival CMS to make through dovetails. If you've seen any of my Incra series so far, then there's going to be a repetition of information inside this video. In fact, all the joint videos. And that's because I want each of these videos to be stand alone. I want them to stand as a reference point. So if you want to be able to come back and do through dovetails, you should just be able to watch this video. Everything you need is self-contained. So there will be repetition, and that's okay because I want you to dip in and out of the right video for you and not having to switch and swap between a multitude of different videos. So let's get started. So by now you will know that the Incra system comes with this rather large manual, and as we've said many times, the reason it's so large is because at the back of the manual you have full-size drawings of the joints that you can make, and at the front of the manual it talks you through setting up the Incra system onto your table. What we're interested in are the sections that start to talk about the various joints, and in a previous video we looked at the box joint. Today we're interested in the through dovetails, and page 8 and 9 of the manual talk to us about how to create the through dovetails on the system. There's a detailed walkthrough that you can see here, and more importantly to us there's a quick step guide that just refreshes us. So once we understand this we can just refer back to the quick step guide, and that should get us going on a new joint. As always, if you're buying the system in Europe, you're buying the metric system, or most likely buying the metric system, and that comes with a supplementary manual, this black and white one. It doesn't give you the information of how to do the joints, but what it basically is a metric version of the various joints that you can make. Again, full-size templates, but this time in the metric version. So we will be using this one to lay out our joints, and we'll be using this one to make sure we're doing things in the right order. As always, I take that quick step guide and I turn it into a cheat sheet, and this just allows me to capture the information that I need, and then just gives me the key pointers of how we go ahead and make the joint. And all these are available if you want to do a similar thing on my website, www.woodgrafter.com. so please feel free to go ahead and don't download those. They're in Word format, so you can corrupt them and change them as you like. But now let's take some measurements and work out what this box is going to look like. In terms of length, I want the box to comfortably be able to take my steel ruler, and this is a 300mm Incra precision ruler. I'll probably also want to be able to drop some pencils inside here. Probably a place to keep the various Allen keys that I've just been resting on the wall for the time being, so I can adjust my tools quickly and easily. And also probably some of my bench dogs that I'm using to hold my rails into position. So that's the sort of stuff that I tend to collect during a project. And so far I've just been leaving it on the table and it rolls off and falls on the floor, or I've just been resting it in the V-grooves and then it gets in the way when I come to clamp something, or I've been putting it on the wall and just resting it on top of my power track on the wall, and then it tends to get in the way and falls off, normally into the wood bin that sits underneath the bench. So that's what we're going to change. So typically that's what we're looking for. So we can see that we want the box to be about 300mm long on its internal dimension to take my ruler, so we'll give a bit of flex overall, and probably width wise anywhere around about 100 would do. So we'll do a 100 by 300 on the internal dimensions. Now the stock we're using for this is just 15mm stock, and this is the stock we're going to use, 15mm wide, about 92mm thick, and they come in 2.4 meter lengths, and it's dirt cheap and it's good enough for shop projects, so that's what we will be using. We know that we want the length, internal length, to be 300, so I know I've got 15mm at the thickness of the ends, so we will make this 300 plus 15 plus 15, which is 330, but I then want a little bit of extra room inside, so let's make the length of our stock 350mm. The width of the box we know is going to be around about 100mm, and that's not that critical for me, so 100 would look pretty good. Now the box height we're actually going to determine from the templates themselves, and I think you've heard me say a number of times now that this is the one area of the Incra fence system that I don't really like, that the templates dictate the width of my stock. That's the part where the dovetail joints are going to come together. The templates dictate that, not my design consideration. So let's dive into the templates and see what we can see. So this is a section where my dovetail joints start, and here's a typical template layout, and down here at the bottom it gives us some key information about the template and how you can use it. These templates work for both through dovetails and blind dovetails, or half blind dovetails as they're called. And down here in the bottom right hand corner you can see an approximate stock thickness. So this template is designed to work with a stock thickness of 6mm. It will work from a half blind of anywhere between 8 and 10mm. Now we know that our stock is 15mm, and I'm not intending to really take that down to 6mm. So job one is to find the templates in the book that work with 15mm stock. So template B works with 6mm, template C works with 7mm, template D works with 7mm, and template E works with 7mm. Template F works with 11mm, and template G works with 11mm. Template H is 11mm, and template I is 15mm. And template J is 15mm, and then template K is 18mm. So for through dovetails we seem to be limited by template I and template J. Now my stock is 90mm wide, so I want something that's going to work with round about 90mm. The templates work best when your stock is centered around these indications here, and you can see 1A, 2A, 3A, 4A, 5A and so on, and you'll see that these marks are in the center point of the areas we're going to cut out with the router bit when we finally get to the router table. So if I measure this looking for 90, you can see there's my 90 mark here. So you could see that this would actually not work very well for me. So I want to reduce the size of my stock down to the nearest increment. And from that point to that point is actually 84mm. So I can't use 90mm stock at 15mm with these templates. The 15mm is set in the templates that we're using for this activity, and therefore I'm going to reduce the stock down to 84mm. And that's a prime example of the templates dictating your stock size and your design considerations not dictating your stock size. That's the only limitations I've said many times, and will say again, that I'm not in love with on the Incra system. But 84mm is the figure that we're going to go for. So I'll come back in and I'll mark my box height as 84mm. Now don't forget we also had a choice of J, and if I look at the center points on J, it's also coming in at 84mm. So it really comes down to, do you like that design on your box, or do you like that design on your box? And that's personal choice. So I'm going to go with a symmetrical joint and go for MDOVI as my template. and I just make a note of that, MDOVI. There's also a unique number here, 16, so this is template number 16. MDOV, metric dovetail, I16 is the template number. Once I've identified the template I'm going to use, there's some key information I now need to record. The first thing I want to record is the approximate depth of cut. No surprising, my approximate depth of cut is 15 millimeters, which is the same as my stock thickness, 15 millimeters. I then want to find my recommended spacing for the depth of cut. And here it is. Spacing to set the depth of cut is 28 millimeters. So the recommended spacing of my depth of cut is 28 millimeters. I need my suggested center. My suggested center on this template is 8A. 8A. And my suggested rebate width, approximate rebate or rabbet width, is 8 millimeters. So we capture 8 millimeters. And then my bit details, and my bit details call for a 5/8 7-degree dovetail bit. So 5/8 of an inch 7-degree dovetail. And you'll notice that the dovetail bit is quoted in imperial, and that's consistent throughout the metric version that we're actually using. For some reason the dovetail bits are still quoted in imperial. The finger joints, the box joints, they're actually quoted in metric. I bought this white side kit and I highly recommend that you do the same. And this kit is actually designed to work with the Incra fence system and the metric Incra fence system. So all the dovetail bits inside this system are all quoted in imperial, and the two box cutters are quoted in metric. So it's easier to see what you need in your template and just pull the right one out rather than converting back into between imperial and metric. So we need the 5/8 of an inch 7-degree cutter, which is this one here. So now I've captured all my information, I can now prepare the stock. Now as I prepare the stock, I obviously want to prepare the left side, the right side, the front and the back of my box, but I also want to prepare two scrap pieces of material at the same thickness, 15 millimeters, and the same width, 84 millimeters. With those dimensions established, I've now gone ahead and I've prepared my stock. Two side pieces, two end pieces, and two scrap pieces that I've cleverly labelled up as scrap. It's important that these are the same dimensions as the stock you're going to use on the project. So they're 15 millimeters in depth and they're 84 millimeters wide. Doesn't matter about the length, but just give yourself a sensible size that you can work with, because we use these to set up the table. As I was preparing the stock, I chose an edge to be a reference edge. You can just maybe see that small arrow there indicating that this is my reference surface. So everything I did when I was milling this, I referenced on this surface, and I'm going to carry that forward into the box construction. So the first thing I do is I assemble my box loosely, making sure that all those reference surfaces are now towards the top. And just for no reason, I put those facing outwards. So I now know that that's the top of my box and how this is going to work. To make my life easier, I then just cleverly mark that with the word top, top, top and top. I now need to work out what's going to be my tails and what's going to be my pins. So with our stock cut, we now need to work out what's going to be the pin boards and what's going to be the tail boards. So this is our template I, and I just want to find the center of my piece of material there. Then coming into the template, put the center of your material on the center point of the template, and if you remember, we captured that earlier on, and it was this position here, 8A, suggested center 8A. And we're going to line up the center of my board to the center part of that material. The grey areas here are the bits that will be left behind once we've made the cut, and the white area are the bits that the router bit cuts out. So you can see in this scenario, if I was cutting this piece of wood, I'm going to have some meat left over here on either end of the board, where if I was using this template here, this set of figures B, still lined up around 8A, I would have a gap cut out of these boards here. The rule's quite simple. If you have a gap cut out at the end, then that is going to be your tail board. So B on this template is tail board for this side of stock. If you have material left over after the cut at the end of your board, that's going to be your pin board. So A in this situation is going to be our pin board. With that knowledge, we can then say, how's this box going to work? Now, all the weight is going to be borne by one of these side edges, and all the material is going to be in the base of this, so it's going to be pulling in this direction. So I want my tails to be on this board here, and my tails will go into my sockets, so any weight is pulling against that joint, and that joint will tighten, not loosen. If I did it the way around and put this as my tail board into pins here, that will be pulling out of the joint, and that gives me a weak construction. So this is going to be my tails, and this is going to be my pins. So we know, so centering around the 8A part, we know I'm going to have meat left over here, so this would be my pin board, and that makes sense. So I can now mark this up as pin and A, pin and A. So similarly, this is going to be a pin and an A board, which means that these must be tail and B board and a tail and a B board. So I now know I'm going to cut my tails in the end pieces, and that makes sense for the structure of the joint, and I'm going to use template B to cut my tails, because I know that when I'm in the center of the board there's going to be a gap either side on the template. Tail board B. Perfect. First setup I want to do is to center my stock to the center point of the router bit, and that just ensures that everything comes out symmetrical when we make the joint. So we know that our material is 84 millimeters wide, so we know that the center point should be somewhere around about 42. So we just make an approximate mark there on the board, and it doesn't matter whether that's right or wrong, it's purely to give us a rough indication. Then raise your router bit a little bit. You don't want to go too high, and that there would be fine, less than halfway up. Now bring in the fence until the center mark you've made is more or less on the center point of that router bit, and that will be about, let's back it off a little bit, roughly about there. We're now going to make a pass, turn it through 180 degrees and make a second pass. And now you can see we've made a nice dovetail shaped groove in our stock, and then just line that up. Now what you're looking for here is an equal gap between this side of the router bit and this side of the router bit, and then you adjust the fence accordingly so it's equal on either side. Now that shows me that the router bit is now centered to the stock that we are going to use, and the fence is now in a position that references that center point. This is the template that we are going to use, MODVI unique number 16, and you can see there's an arrow on the template. That arrow indicates the direction that you insert the template into the Incra fence, and I'm just going to choose any of these available grooves here and slide in the scale. When we captured the information, we had a suggested center and we captured 8A. What that refers to is the marks on side this template. So I'm now going to adjust this so that 8A, which is there, is directly underneath the crosshair, which is there. So I now have my template centered to my fence centered to my stock, and my stock centered to the router bit center. And I can find that again by always returning this rail to 8A, and my stock will be good. The next thing I want to do is to set the overall height of this bit. And again, we took a measurement of the approximate depth of cut, and that was 15 millimeters, same as our stock size, 15 millimeters. So I can now use my scrap piece of wood, and I'm going to raise the height of this so it references the top of my stock, and that's that about there. I now want to make some test cuts using my scrap to make sure that that is in the right position. For that, we're going to use the sliding right angle sled, which simply slots on like this, and we're going to clamp our stock to that sled. While we're doing this, we may as well talk about the clamping routine, and whenever you're using this table, we always go through this clamping routine. Now here's a challenge. When we set the table up, we made sure that this fence was square to this fence, so you can see that it's square to the tabletop, and it's also square to this fence here. However, this has movement in it. It has some ever so slight lateral movement in this direction, but more importantly, it's got the ability to tip backwards and forwards. So although our stock is square, and when we reference it in there, everything sits nice and square, it's very easy to knock this out of position ever so slightly and put twist into it, and when we cut the stock, obviously that's a problem. So we want to be able to clamp this down into position. I can move my fence because we had this thing centered into 8A, so I can now bring the fence up, and all I'm doing is positioning this clamp close proximity to this finger hole here. On the back of the guide there are 3 plastic nuts. These 2 outside adjust this in relationship to the rail, and that's what we tuned to begin with, and the center one clamps it into position, a brake if you will. So bring this back so it's close proximity to the hole, and clamp the middle one in, and that just stops that moving backwards and forwards. It locks it in so it is square to that fence. Then come in with one of these clamps. I find that this type of festool, not the ratchet ones, is easier for this. And use that finger hole just as a clamping position. And all we're looking to do is to clamp this tray flat onto this surface. So now I'm clamped square in this position, and the little plastic knob is clamping me square in that position as well. And with that done, I can now bring in my scrap piece of wood. The final thing to do is to clamp this flat against this fence. If you watch the video that I made on the finger joints, the box jumps, you will know I use this type of quick clamp to put this into position because I found it less cumbersome. However, the type of router bit we've got on this one, the dovetail, is a larger router bit and puts more stress on the wood as it's cutting through. These quick clamps are not strong enough in terms of clamping force to keep this firm while we're making the cuts, and what you'll find, if that's not clamped properly, this wood will twist and it will move as we are making the cut, and your joints will not work. So for that reason, Incra recommend that you use one of these parallel wooden clamps, because this gives you incredible clamping capacity. It's a bit awkward to use, which is why I tended to use the quick clamp on the other joint, but all we're looking to do, make sure this is firm onto the table, make sure it's pressed square against that, and if your stock is squarely cut, you should have no gaps anywhere. Make sure this is clamped down really tight. Now this is not going to move. And with that in place, we can now move the back clamp, and we can remove the captive nut at the back, and that's now going to give me a nice smooth pass across the cut, and this thing is not going to move. I now want to move the fence back, so roughly we are halfway point on that router bit. That's not got to be accurate, it's got to be approximate for this test cut. Using the silver rule, take it to a known increment, i.e. in this case 10 looks quite convenient to me. So my silver rule is now set at 10. What we're going to do is to make a cut with this, and then we're going to take the fence back by 28 millimeters, and the 28 millimeters was the recommended spacing for the depth cut. I think if you were to measure the router bit, you'll realise that from point to point it's 28 millimeters. So that's why we're moving out by 28 millimeters. But don't worry about why, we just know it's 28 millimeters from the measurements we took from the template. So I'm going to make a cut. I'm then going to move this by 28 millimeters, which here would be 12.8. That's why I've centered that piece on a known hole number, 28 millimeters. I now move this back by 28 millimeters, which is 12.58, and lock that into position and make the next cut. And you can now see that we've made two rather nice dovetails, and we've got to check that for fit. And on a flat surface, you just want to see whether you can move those apart or not. Can you see that? There's an ever slight bit of wiggle room there. So that isn't quite tight enough for a joint. Now the rule of thumb is heighten to tighten, lower to loosen. So this is not tight enough, so I want to tighten this joint, and I want to tighten this joint by that gap there, which would be no more than about 1/4 of a turn to heighten this router bit. So just put some crosses on this, because we know we don't want this joint and we don't want to get confused when we come to do the test fit. I'm going to take this 1/4 of a turn to raise this bit. And now I can test the joint again. And there we have a beautifully tight joint. It went together pretty well. It's nice and smooth. There's no gaps around that, and there's no movement inside it, and that's what we're looking for. So this is now set to exactly the right height. Throughout this routine, we do not move this again. Now the recommended approach from Incra is that we would just be doing this on scrap stock, and I wouldn't yet have worked on my joinery. And this works really, really well when we've got rough cut timber and we're going to bring that down to the dimension. And the thickness of my stock on a through dovetail is now set by the height of this router bit. So I would now bring all my stock down to that dimension. I'm not going to do that, and that will mean is that the tails will not fit flush to the edge, and I will need to trim the box down at the end of the day. And I'll do that with a sander or a hand plane, depending how extreme the problem is. Bear that in mind. The same reason that the width of your stock is dictated by the template, the thickness of your stock ultimately is dictated by the height of this router bit to give you this perfect dovetail fit. With that said, we can now go ahead and we can make the joints. I'm now set up for a scoring pass on my router bit, and I'm going to be working on my tails, my B cuts first of all. The reason I've got a scoring pass is I'm going to take material out the end of these boards, because it's the tail board. And if I take that material all in one go, it's going to give me tear out down this edge, and the shoulder will show when we do the final joinery. So I'm going to come ahead and make a scoring pass first of all. I flush the widest part of the router bit to the fence, and that is about there. And once I've got that, I then back off the fence a couple of turns, probably to around about 1/2 millimeter, and I can now lock that into place. So now when I bring my stock across that router bit, it's going to give me a 1/2 millimeter defined shoulder line inside here. And then I can go ahead and make the remainder of the cut using the B template. I want to make sure I capture that, so I'm just going to use this blue scale at the bottom to give me a 0 reference. So I know that whenever I go back to 0 on this scale here, this is at my scoring pass. Now using one of the old bits of scrap, I just want to push this into the back here and go through my clamping procedure again. I've already marked these for top, if you remember earlier on, and that's my reference edge, and I want to put my reference edge against this fence and make sure everything's looking nice and firm, and it is. I'm then going to go ahead and make a scoring pass on this material. I'm then going to creep up to the first B cut on my Incra scale. So I'll go about halfway and I'll make a second cut. I will now go all the way to my first B cut. And now it's simply a matter of making cuts at every B joint. So we'll come in, what's that? So we'll do 8B, we'll do 7B, 6B, and we'll just keep working on these joints here until I've worked all the way across my stock at this end. And with that done, you can see we've now got some beautiful looking dovetails. And these shoulders here are really nice and pristine, and that's going to make a really nice joint. So now we repeat. And there we have it. Our tails for our joints are cut. All looking nice and good, all looking nice and tight. So that's going to work out pretty well, I think. We can now turn our attention to the pin boards, the A cuts. And the technique is exactly the same, but this time we don't need to worry about the scoring pass because the first cut is going to be inside the material. We're not cutting off the outside edges. And now we make the cuts, but we're not going to make the scoring pass. We're going to come straight into our first A cut, and in our case that is 9A. So we come to 9A, lock that down and make the cut. And then we have our pins nicely cut into our boards. Only we haven't, because if you come to try and fit this together, you'll see that this is the wrong shape. So there's some more work to be done on these pieces, and we'll look at that next. So in order to finish these joints off, we've now got to take our pin boards, put them face down and just make the final dovetail shape in the end of this joint. And what we're looking to do is to create that classic V in these end pieces. The way I'm going to set this, I'm going to slide the fence out of the way and I'm going to position it on this middle pin and lock the fence somewhere around about there. And I'll set this up so the external cutter of the router bit is clear of the base of my joint. Then going to come in with a clamp, the Festal one is good again, and a scrap piece of wood and slide it up to that pin. So in effect I've now made a stop block and I'll clamp that into position there, like so. So I can now come along and I can make my cut, and as I hit this stop block I will stop cutting, and that will give me the profile that I'm looking for. And you can just about see it started to make the profile of these V pieces, and the tails will start to slot into there quite nicely. However, it won't seat all the way down, and hopefully you can just about see that here there's these little triangles of wood that's just holding the joint apart. So just down a matter of taking a chisel and just working it down this joint to maintain this angle and to release those little bits of material. Okay, so you can see the dovetails are looking pretty good. Through dovetails, reasonably tight, probably could be slightly better, but good enough for the experiment. So I'm going to go ahead and finish the box off. I'll route a small rebate around this and just drop a base in this, then I'll glue it together and we'll clean it up probably looking at this just with a sander just to take these down to the appropriate size. But yeah, pretty good. So there we have it. We've made the world's most over-engineered piece of firewood. So this hasn't come out very well, but I wanted to share it with you anyway, because I think there's some really good lessons learnt on this one. Now, you can see we've got the classic dovetail look, so that's coming out well. But you can see I've got these slight gaps on either side of the dovetail and similarly small gaps on these end pieces. And I've been thinking about why has that happened, because obviously we set the jig up and we use that accordingly. So why do we have these gaps? I think it comes down to 3 learnings that we need to take forward next time we do this job. The first learning is very much about that stock height. Now remember, the bit that we used when we've done the test joint was slightly high of the material, so that means that when we came in to do the final cut, the bit was proud of the material and therefore it didn't cut exactly the right profile. So yes, indeed, lesson learned, you've got to bring the stock down and use a stock exactly to the height of the bit once we've made that adjustment for the tight joint. So if I wanted to use 15mm stock, I would start with a 17mm stock or 18mm, find the height of my bit, then bring that down accordingly. So when I do my final cuts, that all works. The second lesson is around the use of the scrap piece of wood that comes here to stop us getting tear out. I was using quite a small piece, and as I clamped that in, that obviously allows this to tip a little bit on this pivot point as I clamp. And as I'm making the joints, I noticed this moved ever so slightly because of that pivot point, because think about the pressures that you're putting through there. So we're going to, in future, we're going to be using a higher backing board that's at least the height of the material that we're using, but ideally is slightly higher than the top level of this fence, and that should then remove that situation. And the final lesson was around the use of faces. I made a reference face, if you remember, and I called it top, and then all the way through I kept my reference fences against here. Now that worked well for the tailboards, but on the pin boards, as I used that reference face, put it against the fence and made my cuts, when I turned it round to cut the other end, my reference face was then facing away, and any errors in how we centered that stock up would then show itself, and these joints will come out a little bit too wide. So to counteract that one, when we mark this up, we'll have a face and then we'll have a cut 1 and a cut 2. The cut 1 we will make against the fence in that way, but when we come to cut 2, we'll make cut 2 with a reference away from that fence. And then when we come to do the final cut, we will use that cut 2 reference face away from the fence, cut 1 reference fence towards the fence, and that will keep the wood in the same orientation as the bit as we're moving that fence. So there you go. I thought it was worthwhile sharing that with you. There's our final results for today. I mean, you can see it has worked. We do have dovetail joints inside here, and the box is incredibly strong. So from a functional point of view, we have what we needed, but from an elegance point of view and a refinement point of view, it's nowhere near good enough, and the quality of these joints would never ever appear in any of my furniture projects. So I wanted to share that with you, those 3 lessons. We've got to prep the stock down to the height that's dictated by the height of the router bit. We've got to use scrap pieces that's longer than the board that we're working on, so we don't get that pivot point when we clamp. And the third thing is move the reference faces round so we're always aligned in the same way when we're doing the final cut on those through dovetail pin boards. So lessons learned today, not a perfect job, but I always think that sharing the mistake, but more importantly understanding why that happens, is a great lesson anyway. So I hope you found it useful. See you next time when we're going to look at the blind dovetail.